We are nearing the end of this course. Our app is taking shape, but there is one thing we're not doing that much right now: handling errors. Now, we're actually not doing it at all, you could say. But we should definitely do that. Our app doesn't always behave the way we want it to, or even if it does, the user doesn't. So we want to have something in place which displays some kind of error message, hopefully helpful, to the user whenever something goes wrong. And there are, of course, all kinds of errors that can happen. Maybe the user just enters an invalid email password combination. Well, that's definitely not the end of the world. We don't want to break our application because of that. Maybe the user did do something funky and tried to delete a post when he wasn't allowed to. Well, even then, it's probably nice to show an error message, even though that probably is a case where we don't need to provide the best user experience because the user was doing something fishy. But still, let's handle errors, and let me show you how you could implement such an error handling mechanism in your Angular mean stack app. Back in our app, let's start with logging in and signing up. There, things can go wrong because we can simply enter invalid email password combinations. And we want to handle this. Now, we're of course showing these validation errors to the user already, but if we are trying to create a user with an email address that's already taken, well, then we just get that error on the right and our app is broken. And this is not really what I want to do. I don't want to break my app. We should be able to recover from that and give the user another try. So to add such error handling, the first simple thing to do is add a handler in your observable, which is responsible for sending the erroneous request. So for signing up, for example, in the auth service, here in the create user method, we are subscribing. And we're handling the response here. We're not handling the error, though. We can do so by adding a second argument to the subscribe method. That will be the error handler. Well, there we can simply get that error object which we're receiving. And for example, let's log this to the console. Now, if we save that and we go back to the application, let's try this again. If I enter something invalid here, we still are loading infinitely, but now we're not seeing that big error message. Well, we still got that small one, which makes sense because there is an error after all, and the browser does report this. But the fact that we're seeing this here, if we wouldn't log it here, we wouldn't even see that. So it's less of a big red block. But the main issue we of course still have is that our loader doesn't stop, for example. Now, for signing up and logging in, that simply is happening because if we have a look at our sign up component, and it's the same for signing in, we set is loading to true right before we send the request, but we're not expecting this request to fail. Now, the simple solution here is to simply return our request observable here, so this HTTP post, and to not subscribe here in this component. We don't need the result here anyways, but subscribe in the sign up component. There, when we call create user, we're now getting back the observable, and we can now enter or add that subscribe method here. Don't do anything, so pass null for the first argument. Don't pass a method here because we're not caring about it anyways, but pass a method here, and we get the error there, and we could do anything with it, but for now let's simply set this is loading to false here to remove that spinner again. With that in place, now if we enter that password which is already taken, that email which is already taken, well, now we're getting another try, and now if we do enter something valid here, it fails, right? So something still broke about this application due to that error. Now, the problem here is actually not that it would not send that request. It did. The problem is that it doesn't redirect us. If we have a look at the auth service, for create user, it can't redirect us because we never added this logic here. And now that we remove the subscribe method from that service and put it into the component, we would have to do that redirection here in the sign-up component. So error handling is kind of working, but not ideally. Instead, I want to remove that subscribe call here from the component again. It was nice seeing it, but I don't want to do it here. And put it back onto the auth service. So I won't return that observable. Instead, I will subscribe here. And for the success case, where we created a user, I will indeed use this router and navigate. And for the error case, I'll have to come up with something different when it comes to disabling that spinner. And we would have needed to do that anyways, because in the login component, well, we had no chance of doing that. Because there in the auth service, we got a bunch of logic in the subscribe call, or in that first callback, and therefore it was never an option to put that into the component. So let's see what else we can do. So we want to disable that loader in the signup and login component without subscribing in these components, because we need to subscribe in our auth service due to various things we need to do there. Well, there's more than one way of working around this. For one, we could subscribe in the components and utilize an operator in the auth service, the tab operator, which simply allows us to execute some actions before the observable is done. Now, this would be perfectly fine and would be something we could do here. But we can also use a different approach. We can, of course, use the subject we already have here, the auth status listener. We're not using it in the signup and login component yet, because thus far we weren't interested in whether the user is authenticated or not. Well, we can get interested. So in the signup component, I can implement on init this interface, which we have to import from @Angular core. And therefore, I'm required to add ng on init. And now I can use the auth service, get my auth status listener, and subscribe to it. Now you learned that we have to manage the subscription, so let's store it in the auth status sub property, which is of type subscription, which we actually have to import from our Rex.js. So make sure to add this import. And with that added, we have to add the onDestroy interface here and also import that from @Angular core to then implement ng onDestroy at the bottom, and there using our auth status subscription to unsubscribe. Now that of course means I need to set up a subscription first, and I'm doing it here. I just need to store it. So this auth status sub holds the subscription returned by this subscribe call. Now in that subscribe call, I will get my auth status, which is a Boolean. And I can take that auth status to control my loader. If that switches to false, I want to set this is loading to false. Now in my auth service, in create user, when I'm navigating away, I don't care about that spinner anyways, because we're going away from the component and we're therefore destructuring it. But if we fail, then I actually want to emit an event and inform the entire app that we're not authenticated. Most parts of the app don't really care about this and won't update their templates, but our spinner will actually go away due to our subscription. So I will add my error handler as the second argument in this subscribe method now, and then use my auth status listener to push that false value to the entire app. And now if we save that, and we go back and we try to sign up for a given email address again, now you see it fails. And if I now take another one which wasn't taken, then I do sign up there. We can check the network tab and see that indeed we did create a new user successfully. But somehow we're not getting redirected. But this was simply happening due to a compilation error on my side. Now that I restarted this, if I try this again, and I sign up with credentials which are taken, I fail. But if I then use credentials which are not taken, so an email address which is not taken, I successfully sign up. And that of course means we can use that same flow in the login component. So let me copy ng on init and the constructor from the signup component, put it into the login component. Well, we already got the constructor there, but let's still override it then. Let's implement on init and on destroy here too. Make sure to import both from @Angular core. And then from the signup component, I'll take my auth status subscription and add this field here at the beginning. Subscription is something we need to import from Rex.js, so copy that import too and add it in your login component. And last but not least, we also need to unsubscribe So let's take ng on destroy, go to the login component, and also add this to clear our subscription. And now we get the same setting here too. Now if we fail to log in, we should actually remove that spinner. So if we go to log in, and let's say we enter an invalid password, then I'm not authorized. And yeah, we should, of course, go to the auth service to log in and handle the error case here in the subscription too, because we are, of course, setting up the subscription to the response there. So let's add this second argument, which is that error we're getting. And there we're using the auth status listener and will emit false as a value. And now we got everything in place we need to go back, enter invalid credentials, and remove that spinner and get a second try. And if we then enter the right credentials, here we are. So now we got this in place. It would still be nice to see some kind of error message, I guess. So let's work on this next. As I mentioned, it would be nice to have some error message when we're, well, getting an error. And for that, we can use an Angular material component. Of course, you could build something similar on your own. There we have a component, the Dialog component. We find it here under pop-ups and modals. There we got that dialog, which really looks like that. We can show our own message there in the middle of the screen. And you could, of course, create your own modal, any div with some content, some backdrop, and attach both conditionally with ngIf, or, well, use this solution here, which we will use in this course. So how does this work? We can inspect the source code, and there the TypeScript code is the interesting part. This dialog component here happens to work programmatically. We open a dialog by using the dialog service provided by Angular Material, and we actually pass in a component reference which will be rendered inside of that dialog which is opened. Now that is a bit of a more advanced solution here, rendering a component dynamically. The easy solution would be, as I just mentioned, to really just add some div, maybe in the app component, and then use ngIf combined with some error condition to show or hide this. So let's use that dialog though, and let me show you how to generally handle errors and show and hide something if we got an error. For that, I want to register a global error handler. And since our errors are related to HTTP errors, I want to use my interceptor again. This auth interceptor here is used to, well, intercept all outgoing requests and add the auth header. We can add another interceptor, and I will add it here in my root folder since it will affect the entire app. I will add my error interceptor file, so error.interceptor.ts. Now keep in mind, we got the auth interceptor, and there we used a dash, so let's use one here too. Error dash interceptor. And now here, I will create an interceptor just as I did it for auth. So let's copy the entire auth interceptor code and let's put it into the error interceptor. I won't need the auth service though, so no need to inject it. No need for injectable then, because we're not injecting a service here right now. And therefore we can also remove the injectable import here. And now in the intercept method, I just want to return next handle request, but now we can actually also listen to the response there. I don't want to edit the request, I want to listen to the response. And handle actually gives us back the response observable stream. And we can just hook into that stream and listen to events. And we can use the pipe method provided by RxJS to add an operator to that stream. And I want to add a special operator, the catch error operator, which you need to import from rxjs/operators. Catch error, as the name suggests, is an operator that allows us to handle errors emitted in this stream. And since this is for an HTTP request, we'll be talking about HTTP errors. Here, we have to pass a function where we will get our error, which will be of type HTTP error response, which you can import from @angular comment HTTP. And then we can, of course, console log it, for example. Now, we can do that, but one thing we absolutely have to do here is we have to keep in mind that we're just adding something to that observable stream. We're finally handling it in different places of our app. In the post service where we subscribe, in the auth service where we subscribe to our requests. So we absolutely have to return an observable here inside of catch error, even if we had an error. And we can just use throw error for this, a method which we import directly from RxJS. And this will generate a new observable to which we can just pass that error. And now we just return that observable here. So now we're just returning that observable with the error, but we can do some error handling here. And for example, we can also alert, to throw a normal JavaScript alert, error, and on that error object, we actually have an error property, which will be the response body of the error request, or of the error response, I should say. And there we could output the message and hope to have one. We'll refine this later. So now we can register this interceptor in our app module, where we also registered the auth interceptor, by copying this provider. Same token, also use multi, but here we use the error interceptor. And for that, I need to rename that class first. So in the error interceptor file, this is now the error interceptor class. Now we can use that in app module. Here, error interceptor. We also need to import this. So at the top, we import error interceptor from /error interceptor. So from that file we just created. Now every outgoing HTTP request will have this interceptor attached to it. And if I recompile, this strange error is also gone. So now every outgoing HTTP request will be watched by this. And if we get back an error response, this interceptor should kick in. So let's give this a try. We're not using that material dialog yet, but let's give this a try on the sign up page again. If I do enter an email address which is already taken and I hit sign up, we get back an alert with undefined because we don't have a message here as it seems. But we see that the interceptor is doing something, and we also see the log from inside the interceptor here. There we can see the error response we're getting. That's the response body. And there we actually have a message field. So error message should actually yield something. Though I see because of the error we're getting back from the server, which is automatically generated by our Mongoose unique validator, we have another level of error in there. And that's really just because that Mongoose unique validator adds another error object nested in there. So it's error.error.error.message. Yeah, that is really weird. But now we would actually be able to see something here. Now we get user validation failed, email error expected, email to be unique. Now that is not a message I want to show anyways, and that is one of the rare cases where we have this extra level of nesting. So let's ignore it for now. But you see that we can actually access error information, and that we have an error object which actually holds the response, and we can access the response body on that nested error object. And as you saw in the log, we also got other things like the exact status code we're getting, and so on. So this can really help you handling your errors. Now that we added this interceptor, let's use it and add something better than this boring alert in the next lecture. We added the error interceptor and it's working, as we could tell. It's not optimal yet though. We just throw an alert here and the console log. I want to use that Angular material dialog though. Now to use it, first of all, we need to unlock it. So let's go to the app module and import something from the Angular material package. And that something is the mat dialog module. As you know, importing it here isn't enough. We also have to add it to our imports array down there. Now we unlock the mat dialog. Now we can open a dialog by injecting the dialog service into whichever place in our app where we want to use it, and then calling open on the injected object. And there we pass a reference to the component, which we want to use as a content for the dialog. and some additional configuration like the width, for example, or additional dynamic data we want to pass into that component here. This is how it works. You can read more about this in the official Angular material docs, of course. So I want to use my dialog in the Error Interceptor here. Therefore, we have to re-add injectable here, because now I want to inject a service into this service. So add it here and import it from @Angular core. Add the constructor. And in that constructor, I want to inject my dialog service. The service name is mat_dialog and needs to be imported from @Angular material. Now we got the dialog available, and now we can display something with it. But as you just heard, we need to add a component which we want to use as the content. So we'll actually add a new component here on the top level, nested in a folder which I'll name error. And there I will add my error.component.ts file. As you learned, I just create a new class here which I export, error component. And it actually becomes a component by adding the add component decorator here. Now we don't need to add a selector here because we're not using that component by its selector anyways, but we need a template URL best. This gives us the most flexibility. So for that, I'll add my template file, error.component.html here, and I will point at this file here in my decorator, error.component.html. So now I'm pointing at that file. Now we can define what we want to see in that error dialog we're going to open. In there, I simply want to have a h1 tag where I say an error occurred, and below that a paragraph with the message. And I will use string interpolation to output a message property, which I'll add to my component here. Message by default will be an unknown error occurred. Now I will have to register this component in my app module by going to declarations there, and here I will add my error component and make sure to add this import path too. Now we need to do something special. Since we're going to load that component neither through a selector nor through routing, we have to tell Angular that it needs to be prepared to eventually create this component. It normally detects that it needs to be prepared by the fact that we somewhere use the selector or that we use it as a component in the router. But since we will dynamically create that component or let that dialog service create it dynamically, we need to tell Angular that this is going to happen. Otherwise, we would get an error. And for that, we add a fifth item here to our ng module configuration, the entry components array. You rarely need to use that, but here you do. There you add the error component, and this simply informs Angular that this component is going to get used even though Angular can't see it. So now let's go to the Error Interceptor and use that dialog service to open a dialog with this error component. So here I will reach out to my dialog service, call the open method, and there I will pass in my error component. You also need to add an import to that error component in the Error Interceptor file then. And with that added, here we're opening the error component. Now we should actually be able to already see it. If we save that and we go back to our sign up form, if I use an email address that is already taken, now you see an error occurred here. So let's edit this error dialog we were seeing. Now we had a couple of problems, the styling and the fact that we didn't see the message. Now the message can't be seen because of the way this component is created. We can't set up properties here like this. We can still pass data into that component though. I want to display a message, but we can pass in data with a different or in a different way. In the Error Interceptor, where I'm opening the dialog, we can pass in data by adding a second argument to the open method, and there we can set a data property. This allows us to pass in an object which represents the data we want to work in this error component. Now I only want to get one piece of information in there, the message. And the message is something I need to derive in this error interceptor. I will check if my error, if there the error object, which is the response body, if it has a message property. If it does, then I want to use that. Otherwise, I will use a dummy message. So I will create a new variable, let error message, and set the default to an unknown error occurred. Now I will override this default if we got a real message. So then I will take error.error.message. Now in either way, I got an error message variable which holds a string, and I can pass this as data to my error component. Now to retrieve that data there, we have to go to the error component and inject something into it. Something which will also be provided by Angular material. We pass in that data by using a special decorator, the @inject decorator, not injectable, but inject, which you import from @Angular core. And this allows you to then specify a special token. And that will just be important for the dependency injection system Angular uses to identify this data you're passing around. This special way of injecting is required due to the special way this error component is getting created with. The token I want to use is the mat dialog data token, and you import that from @Angular material. That is the identifier used internally. This will hold data, and I will use that shortcut to store it in a public property of that class, which is of type any, or we actually know that it's of type object, which holds a message, which is a string. So this is now a field which is available in the error component, and we can output it here, therefore. We can output data, message in our component template. We now save that, and we try signing up with a taken email address again, we get an unknown error. Because remember, for this error, we get no better error message. Now the styling looks awful, but thankfully, the Angular material dialog gives us some classes that help us here. We can add the mat dialog title, directive, not class, directive, to the h1 tag, and to the paragraph we can add mat dialog content. These selectors added to these elements will lead to a much nicer look, as you can tell. This looks much better already. Now, the paragraph still looks wrong though, because mat dialog content is incorrectly added to the paragraph. It should be added to a wrapping div. And you can find these things in the official docs, in case you're wondering where I got this from. So now with that added, we'll get a little bit of a nicer styling. The paragraph would still have a different font though. And to change this, we can simply add a class provided by the Angular material package, a class named mat-body1. By adding this class here, if we now try this again and use a taken email address, now we got a nicer font there too. Now it might be nice to also have some buttons there, and we can simply add a normal button by adding another div which should have the mat dialog actions selector to position them correctly, just as the content is positioned correctly with that. And here we can add a normal button with the mat button selector you already know from the other parts of this app. And there we can simply add a OK button, for example. We can add another special directive to that, the mat-dialog-close one, and this will ensure that this button automatically closes the dialog if we click it. So now, if I try this one last time here, we got this button, and if I click somewhere else, it closes it. This was not what I wanted to show. If I now click on OK, we also close the button. So this is now working, and now we have a nicer dialog. We got a default message which we display. Obviously, it would also be nice to use or see this error handler in action for other errors where we have a better message. We get the error dialog in place. It's showing the standard error message for our sign up error, because for the user route here, where we create a new user here on the backend, we actually have that Mongoose unique validator, and if that detects an error, it'll automatically send back, or actually reach that part here, and we then just send back the normal error response. Well, what we could do here is we could send back an error with our own error object where we do add a message. And there we could say invalid authentication credentials. Now that's at least a bit more helpful than the standard error message. Now for our frontend to work correctly though, I need to remove that extra level of nesting here, that extra error property. Let's just send back a response which has this message property. With this change, we should already see an improvement if we save this. If we go back and we again try to create a user for a taken email address, we see the invalid authentication credentials message here. And that's really useful now, because now we got a great way of displaying our own error messages. So let's go through the server side and ensure that we are sending correct error messages in all cases. For logging in, we're also catching errors and we're sending back auth failed. Now maybe we also want to say invalid authentication credentials here too. If we go to check auth, there we also send back a response with auth failed if we identify that the user doesn't have a valid token. So maybe here we want to update the message to say, you are not authenticated. If we go to our posts routes, let's go through it from top to bottom. We got our multer thing going on, but we're not sending back errors here, so we can ignore this for now. In the post method here, where we create a new post though, we're not handling error cases. What I want to do here is, I want to add a catch block after this then block, and this should execute whenever something does fail. So here, I will set a response with a status code of 500 for something went wrong on the server, and add some JSON data where I can set up a message where I say, creating a post failed. Now that's not super meaningful, but it is at least something. So now we're also catching errors here. If we move on to that update path here or route here, there we are updating our posts and we are already sending back a response if we don't have a technical error, which would go into a catch block, but if we simply don't find a post to update, then we are sending back not authorized. I also want to catch technical errors, like if the database connection is lost or anything like that. And therefore here, I will also return a custom response with a status code of 500, where I send back my JSON code or my JSON data. And there I will set a message of couldn't update post. And that's important to understand, by the way. Catch will only be reached if something goes wrong technically here. If we just don't find a valid post, we still go into the then block here, but we will have a result where nothing is modified. This is why we're handling it like this here, with that else condition. Now let's move on to getting posts. If we want to get posts here, we are returning our posts, and we're getting the count of posts. And I also want to catch technical issues here. So here, if we got an error, I want to return a response with a status code of 500, where I add my JSON object with a message of fetching posts failed. Now we got that in place. Let me copy that catch block and also add it to that method here, where we try to find a single post here at the end. Fetching post failed is the correct message here. And we also handle the case that we did not have a technical issue, but that we just did not find a post, and there we have a post not found message too. Now for deleting posts, we also handle the case that we just were not authorized or anything like that, and I will also my technical error handler here with that catch block. Now with that, I updated all the error messages, and if we save that, we can actually have a look at that on the front end. For that, let's go to the post list component and let's temporarily remove that check which hides the edit and delete buttons. If we remove that, we will be able to trigger these requests without being authorized. So if we go back, and please have a look, I'm not logged in. I see these buttons again. If I click delete now, I get you are not authenticated. Now we also see that the spinner doesn't go away in that case. And it should go away, of course. The problem we have is that in the post list component, where we are setting isLoading to true whenever we start loading, when we trigger onDelete, well, we never set it back to false if we fail. Now here it's super easy to do so though. We are subscribing to the response, and we can simply add a second method to subscribe here to also be informed about errors, and then set isLoading back to false. By adding this here in the onDelete method in the post list component, we should be able to click delete, see the error message, and then still interact with our app. Now if I click edit, we actually are redirected to the login page anyways, because I still have that mechanism in place. If I now do log in, but with a user who didn't create that post, I now also see the buttons because we removed that check. Now I also get not authorized, and if I try to edit this, well, then I get it loaded here, but if I try to update this, I also get not authorized. And keep in mind, these are cases which are a bit fishy anyways, because we are reaching parts of the app where we shouldn't be able to get in a legit way. So we don't need to provide the best user experience here, but having some fallback is certainly not a bad idea. Now I will go back to my post list component template and re-add this ngIf check to my buttons here so that we don't see them if we shouldn't see them. But it was nice seeing our error handler in action here. Now the application is looking and working nice. There's one more thing I want to do. If for some reason an error should occur on the new post page, then I want to also not show the spinner anymore. Because right now on the post create page, just as on other pages too, or at least just as we had it on other pages, we are setting isLoading to true whenever we are saving that post. And then we don't care about the fact or about the result of this add post or update post operation. Now caring about it is easy though. We can again use that auth status listener just as we did on the sign up and login page. So for that, I'll add a new private property, private auth status sub, which is of type subscription, to store that subscription we're going to create. Don't forget to import subscription from RxJS. And with that added here, we can inject our auth service here, auth service of type auth service. You also need to import that type from your auth service file. And if you got it injected, then you can set up a listener in ng on init. This auth service get auth status listener, subscribe to it, store the subscription in the auth status sub property you created. And here we get the auth status. And whenever this changes, I will simply set this isLoading to false, because if that changes, we'll always need to disable the loader. That is something we know about our application. The only conditions where this can change are conditions where we want to, well, stop our loader from loading. So now we have that listener set up. We should also unsubscribe in onDestroy. So let's add the onDestroy interface, import it from @Angular core. And with that added up here, let's go to the bottom of that file. Let's add ng onDestroy here, and let's reach out to our auth status subscription and call unsubscribe. And now we also handle that rare case that for some reason we get an error here. Well, then we would at least remove that spinner. And that is error handling as I want to implement it in this application. You can always do more, show more detailed error messages, handle errors differently for different components. This is just one possible flow. A very elegant flow as I think though, because with that global interceptor, We have a very minimal amount of code we need for handling these errors. We have our separate error component, which is a great practice, and therefore error handling is really made easy in this application.